Welcome back to the Flex Diet Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Mike Nelson. On this podcast, we talk about all things to increase your ability to add on muscle, increase performance, improve body composition, do all of it within a flexible framework without destroying your health. Today, important announcement if you're listening to this as of Monday, October 20th, 2025. The Physiologic Flexibility Certification closes tonight at midnight Pacific Standard Time. So if you're listening to this as of today on Monday, there's still time to get in if you want to enroll, which I would highly recommend, of course, because I'm biased and I created the course. You can go to the newsletter link below and then just hit reply, and I'll get back to you within a couple hours. I've got a couple newsletters going out today about some more information about it. It's probably going to be the best place. If you go over to the old Instagram, you'll be able to find a link in my bio page there also. And yeah, I'm super excited. I've got a bunch of people who said they were going to enroll today also. I know everybody waits till the last minute, which I totally understand as I am one of them. But if that is you, your time is ticking down. The next time it will be open is scheduled to be open in March of 2026. So hop on now, hop onto the newsletter. Hit me up with any questions you have on the certification there. We do have payment plans on the site there. I did send out a notice about some secret bonus items that I didn't make public, so you want to check out those, or if you missed them, just hit reply on to the newsletter, which is free to hop on, and you get all sorts of great information from me. So today I wanted to talk about what I think is probably the biggest key in the Physiologic Flexibility Certification. I'd say there's two of them, and not many people talk about it at all, but I find it super fascinating. So the first one I've talked about on this podcast before is what I call HDR, human dynamic range. Simply, the greater range you have over your physiology, or that your physiology can exert, I think the better position you're going to be in. A simple example is heart rate. All things being equal, a higher heart rate and a lower heart rate, in essence, gives you a greater human dynamic range. If all their variables are the same, this allows you much higher levels of performance. It allows you to upregulate to the task and then also to heavily downregulate to the task. Now, I know heart rate may not be the best marker because that is a result of different adaptations, but it's just a way to frame how to think about these things. A respiratory rate would be another one. Higher respiratory rates, again, this is assuming you can move a fair amount of air, and lower respiratory rates are a good thing. So the bigger range you have there, again, all their variables being the same, is going to be better. So we'd want to see a low respiratory rate overnight. Ideally, my biased opinion, probably around 12, maybe 13. 14 is okay. 15, yeah, you're on the edge. 16, 17, you definitely need to work on that. We go super deep into that on the carbohydrate, or I should say not carbohydrate, but carbon dioxide tolerance area, which is pillar number 4 in the Phys Flex Cert, all about oxygen and CO2 regulation. I could take HDR of sprint performance. So the faster you can go from 0 to top end speed, that is going to be a benefit. The faster you can run, and almost all sports, is a benefit. Now again, there's specificity of sports. Is it linear? Is it change of direction, etc.? So that'd be concept number 1. How fast can you change direction and what are the ends? This is very similar to the concept of metabolic flexibility. On the right end of the spectrum, how well can you use carbohydrates? How far can we push that to the right? And think of a kind of a barbell type model. How well can you use fat on the other end? Or can you downregulate, use fat to a high degree? Part 3 is how well can you switch back and forth between these two? Very similar with the concept of human dynamic range. How high is your high? How low is your low? How fast can you switch back and forth between them? This is also the basis for the flexible cardio courses. So in there we do a lot into the depth of the different cardiovascular performance But there is some ways you can test this. For example, you could do a 1 minute or 2 minute heart rate recovery test, which I think is a great test that is vastly underutilized by a lot of people. What this is telling you is what was your max heart rate, what is your resting heart rate, and then transitions. How fast can you get back to baseline? The faster you can be back to baseline is a benefit, and I would argue for both performance, recovery, and health. This is a sign of a high amount of parasympathetic tone, or what's called parasympathetic reactivation, so the braking portion. So if we use the analogy of a fancy car, we'll take an F1 car, because I got to present to those guys a couple weeks ago, which was amazing. That was awesome. The F1 cars, not only are they great for acceleration, handling, have huge horsepower, they have massive brakes so that you can control that and you can decelerate as fast as possible also. So the second part is what's called cross-adaptation. Very simply, you can think of this in terms of training as transfer. So for example, if you want to deadlift more, then the SAID principle, specific adaptation to impose demand, would say that, shocker, you need to deadlift. And if your goal is to do 1 RM, 3 RM, or 5 rep max, the more specific you can make it to that goal, that is going to get you there faster. Now the downside of this, anyone who's done lifting knows that you're not going to go to the gym every day and try to do a 1 RM on your deadlift. Now you might get by with it if you're new. You may get by with it a few days. Again, I would not recommend that you do this. So there is a limitation to how often you can do very specific practice. Now again, the more you can do that, I do think you will get to your goal faster, but there's some limitations on that, whether it's structurally, energy, nervous system wise, etc. But you can do other things that may transfer to your deadlift and have it go up. They may not look like a deadlift. So if you're a big fan of kettlebells and you've read lots of Pavel stuff, you may say, well, kettlebell swings. So I'm going to do kettlebell swings and see if that increases my deadlift. If it does, then the kettlebell swing transfers to increase your deadlift performance. The kettlebell swing doesn't look anything like a deadlift, but increasing your kettlebell swing performance transfers to increasing your deadlift performance, or what the fancy words are, gets into dynamic correspondence and all that kind of stuff. If we take those concepts now and we transfer them to physiology at large, we do see something in the physiology literature which is called cross-adaptation. You're doing something that improves said thing and then transfers to something else. So in the Physiologic Flexibility Certification, we talk a lot about this. In the best examples are actually in the temperature regulation area of heat to hypoxia cross-adaptation. So here's a study from Dr. Rodriguez in Exercise Physiology 2025. A heat to hypoxic cross-adaptation. Effects of 6 weeks post-exercise hot water immersion on exercise performance in acute hypoxia. So again, this has lots of really fancy words. So hypoxia is just a fancy word for low levels of oxygen. And what was cool on this study is that they did it for 6 weeks. So they're looking at post-exercise hot water immersion. So what I call this in the Cert tubby time. You're doing some type of hot tub type thing. And we're going to look at how does that affect in this case, acute hypoxia. So exposure to a low-level oxygen condition, which in humans is very threatening. Now, this could be from a long breath hold. This could be from fancy type equipment you could use in the lab, or also just simply exercise-induced, right? Because at some point, when you max out aerobic exercise, you've maxed out the body's ability to get oxygen, so you are going to have a slight hypoxic condition there. So, what did they do? This study evaluated the effectiveness of a 6-week program of hot water intervention on exercise performance in hypoxia. So here hypoxia was an O2 of 13%, which is pretty darn low. So they took 20 healthy volunteers that were 28 years old, and they had a VO2 peak of 47, so pretty good. This is 12 males, 8 females. They completed some fun interval cycling. This is a classic Norwegian 4x4. So 4 rounds of 4 minutes at 90% of max heart rate. And they did this 3 times a week. So they really beat the crap out of these people. And then they followed that by hot water immersion, either at 34.5 degrees Celsius, the control, or 42.0 Celsius. So they've got just a neutral water condition, and they've got the warm water, and they did that for 40 to 50 minutes, 5 times per week. So what did they find? So following the 6-week intervention, post-exercise hot water immersion group exhibited lower resting heart rate and core temperature, and they actually had elevated hemoglobin concentrations. Now this matches some of the other literature with sauna showing expansion of hemoglobin, sometimes plasma volume. If you increase plasma volume in general, you'll see a lower resting heart rate. And I would theorize that's probably what's going on here. Also, compared to the control group, the hot water immersion group showed greater improvements in time to exhaustion during a trial. Under hypoxia, but not in aerobic peak or peak oxygen consumption. So what's interesting is that only under the hypoxic condition did they see those changes. Now remember, both groups here are doing the same exercise intervention. Just one is doing hot water immersion, the other is just doing neutral water immersion. What's also interesting is that during the hypoxic steady state exercise, which they did at 60% of VO2 peak, the hot water immersion group exhibited lower core temperature and higher peripheral oxygen saturations, even despite the hypoxic condition. What they also observed was no difference in group was observed between mean VO2, respiratory exchange ratio, heart rate or perceived exertion, nor in VO2 peak and aerobic peak under normal oxygen conditions. So what I find here is super interesting that the benefits, we did see a little bit lower heart rate and some other things, but most of the benefits showed up only when they were very stressed under the hypoxic condition. So in this study, they concluded post-exercise hot water immersion enhances maximal exercise performance under acute hypoxia, likely due to increased hemoglobin concentration, lower core temp, and improved respiratory efficiency. So super fascinating. And what you find is a lot of the changes due to CO2 and O2 regulation, some of those do actually acutely increase performance, some do not, and some are very hyper-specific to certain cases. So when I was doing the creation of the Phys Flex Cert, the O2 and CO2 regulation portions, oh man, that took me the longest by far, because I was trying to condense basically respiratory physiology, changes in oxygen, changes in pressure, changes in concentration, trying to take all this stuff and make it both usable based on the research and also accurate, because there is a ton, in my opinion, of misinformation in that area. So one other part I wanted to talk about here is there's some really cool studies in this area. This one here is a cross-adaptation to heat stress to hypoxia, systematic review and exploratory meta-analysis. This is by Wilmot, and this was published in the Journal of Thermal Biology, February 2024. And so they did pull 9 studies, did a whole bunch of stuff, and what they found was that, quote, cross-adaptation may be appropriate for individuals such as occupational and military workers whose access to altitude exposure prior to undertaking submax activity in hypoxic conditions is restricted. Right? This is back to the transfer effect. So maybe they can't get specific adaptation practice, so maybe we can do this other thing and have it transfer. Methodological variations exist within the current literature, and females and well-trained individuals have yet to be investigated. Further research should focus on these cohorts and explanatory mechanisms underpinning cross-adaptation. So there isn't a ton of data in cross-adaptation right now. There is more and more data coming out all of the time, and it is, I find, just a fascinating area. And so they've got a really cool graphic here that looked at everything from cardiovascular to respiratory to thermoregulatory perception and performance. And most of the benefits, if I were to summarize this, show up with specific practice and potentially under maximal exercise performance. Now again, that data is limited. Not all studies agree on that, but that would make sense because during maximal exercise, if you're going to have any sort of hypoxic condition, that is probably when it's going to show up the most. Another table, this is from heat to hypoxic cross-acclimation experimental data. Just gave a brief overview of some of the studies. I'm not going to go through all of them here. But Health did one 2012. They did a heat acclimation protocol, 12 days, 120 minutes per day. And they used walking at 30% of VO2 peak. What they found was, in terms of adaptation to heat, peak heart rate dropped by 12 beats per minute, and peak time, temperature-wise, dropped also. And that makes sense, right? So that is a specific adaptation to heat. We go over a lot of the heat adaptations in the Phys Flex Cert. The short answer there is, depending on what you're doing, you can probably get relatively close to maximal heat adaptation within 2 to 3 weeks. Now again, are you going to hit 100% adaptation in that time period? No, but you can get pretty darn close. So they did a hypoxic protocol, and what they found was improvements response to hypoxia. Heart rate at certain levels was much lower. So another study by Lee, 2014, heat acclimation period was only 3 days, 75 minutes per day, including 15 minutes preliminary rest. They did heat tolerance increase by 3 minutes, sweat rate increased by 23%, plasma volume went up by 4.6%. So in only 3 days, we're already seeing a relatively large, let's say 5% change in plasma volume. This is also why in the Phys Flex Cert we talk about the benefits of sauna from both physiology in terms of what you can expect to see. And the big one is plasma volume changes. If you acutely increase your plasma volume, you will increase your aerobic capacity. Cyclists used to do this by doing infusions. Again, it's very limited because your body, on that point, you're going to overload your system, which you have to be careful with because you can run into issues. Again, I'm not recommending that, but it just shows that the principle works. Again, if you go high overload, you do run some risks for sure, and your body will diurese or it will get rid of some of that plasma volume relatively fast. Where sauna or heat acclimation, those plasma volumes stay around as long as you are acclimated to the heat, and your body will not just basically piss them out right away. Hypoxic protocol, they did 15 minutes at rest and then 60 minutes at 50% of VO2 peak by changing the amount of oxygen. And what they saw in terms of improved response to hypoxia, a mean heart rate dropped about 9 beats per minute, and a bunch of other temp regulations were better. So anyway, I won't go through all of these, but some very cool stuff showing that there is cross-adaptation effects between temperature regulation, how your body is doing that, and its ability to function in a hypoxic environment. So how does this work? Again, we're not 100% sure. Most of this, if you go down to the cellular level, is that these heat stresses will trigger the production of protective proteins like heat shock protein 72. These can help the body cope with cellular damage caused by hypoxia. At a systemic level, both heat and hypoxic stress can activate similar adaptive pathways, leading to systemic improvements in how the body handles these different environments. What we notice with effects of heat acclimation on hypoxia, there tends to be a reduced strain. Individuals show lower core body temperature, lower heart rate, and lower blood lactate accumulation in submax exercise in a hypoxic environment. And this was only after heat adaptation. Again, this also works with some cold adaptation also. They did show increased performance, right? So the body ability to exercise longer in duration of a hypoxic condition, and actually improved oxygen saturations. So peripheral oxygen sats can lead to increases during exercise in hypoxia. Again, if you want to get super fancy, you can even measure blood levels, or what's called SMO2, with NIRS devices such as the Knox device or the Moxie device. And I have both of those, so it's been fun to play around with this stuff. And the cool part is that a lot of these changes happen relatively fast. They've shown repeated heat exposure over several days to a few weeks does show some effect. And like I said, the study we showed there did show effects from a 6-week intervention. Now, is this going to lead to amazing performance and be the number one thing you should do by all means? No. In all honesty, I'd probably sell a lot more courses if I told you yes, but obviously doing exercise is going to be number one. Proper nutrition and sleep, those are all covered in the Flex Diet Cert. Those are the basics, but if you're getting, I'd say, at least a B in there, then I would explore the other interventions in the Phys Flex Cert. Number one is going to be temperature. This is both cold and hot. Number two is pH changes, which we didn't talk about today, but this is involved a lot with high intensity exercise and different types of breathing techniques. Number three is expanded fuels, so lactate and ketones. Right, so if we're exercising in extreme environments, we're more likely to have higher levels of lactate. If we're really pushing high intensity intervals, we're going to produce lactate as a byproduct. Ketones are up on the other end, more from fasting and running a ton of fat through the system. And it turns out both of these expanded fuels have a lot of really cool molecular effects. And with ketones, you have the advantage of consuming an exogenous source of ketones. You don't necessarily have to do a ketogenic diet to get there. And so this opens up a lot of cool stuff you can do of consuming exogenous ketones. My bias is Tecton ketone esters. A full disclosure, I do some work for them and I am an ambassador for them. But we've seen data from them and other companies that consuming these ketone esters on an empty stomach within 20 minutes, you can hit a 2, 3, 4 millimolar blood levels of ketones. So that's pretty fun to play around with that, and there are some benefits to that, especially with high level exercise and cognitive function, and potentially even in some pathologies, such as a TBI concussion. I did a whole educational series for the Carrick Institute. I do a lot of functional or clinical neurology, so I'm an associate professor with them. I did a whole program for them for their docs on potential benefits of ketones there. The last component is going to be, like I said, oxygen and CO2 regulation. And where the most cross-adaptation literature right now is between temperature and hypoxia. If I were a betting person, I am going to bet that there are other cross-adaptation effects within those four pillars I just talked about. Although I can't point to a lot of data yet, because no one has really looked at it. But all of these things overlap, they cross over each other, and I think improvements in each one of those areas from what I've seen over the past, I've probably been doing work in this area for almost 7, 8 years now. It just seems like people are more resilient to just other stressors overall, even if it's not a heat stressor, even if it's not a cold water stressor. And I do think that is because of these cross-adaptations running in the background. Now, again, have we fully elucidated all of those? No. We've only scratched the surface there. But if I'm a betting person, my bet is we're going to find a lot more of these cross-adaptations working in the background. And then the last part is most people are not super adapted to these four areas, so they don't need a ton of work to get better in those areas. Again, if you haven't done a lot of cold water immersion or cold water, even just taking a cold shower is a great start. And again, you probably don't need a lot of exposure because you're not adapted to it. Just like if you're new to exercise, you don't need a super fancy program. You just need some basic stuff to provide overload to your system, and you're good to go. If you haven't done a lot of super high intensity intervals work, again, in an intelligent manner, you don't need a ton of it. Even when you are more experienced, you still don't need a ton of it. So I think these are areas you can see a lot of bang for your buck. Again, once you're getting a B on basic exercise, nutrition, and sleep without investing a ton of time. Now, again, there are some adaptations you may have to invest a little bit more time in, but most of them are not super time intensive if exactly you know what to do. So there we go. There's all the information on human dynamic range and the cross-adaptation effect. Both of those I find absolutely fascinating, and I think you'll be hearing a lot more about them in the future. If you like those concepts, you will love the Physiologic Flexibility Certification. It is closing tonight, however, as of this recording, which is Monday, October 20th, 2025, closes at midnight Pacific Standard Time. We'll put a link to the newsletter there. Hit me up on the newsletter with any questions. I will have a couple more information going out there. If you want to purchase the link, you can go to the Instagram account, which we'll link. It's in my bio there also. Anything I can do to help you out. Last part is when you sign up and enroll in the Cert, you get personal access to me. Like you literally get my private email, which is me. It's not an AI bot or my assistant or anyone. They go directly to me, and you can ask any questions about the certification because I do want to actually help you. I'm not making it difficult for you to get in touch with me. I know some other, we'll say, educational products, like you don't have any interaction with the instructor, but I do want to physically help you with whatever I can, whether that's protocol development, whether it's something in the coursework you didn't understand. All of it is 100% online, so you can go through it at your own pace. There's no rush to complete it. You get the big picture, how everything works together in terms of physiologic flexibility, and then you get a really deep dive into the research of each area. It is presented in a way that it is more, I'd say, intermediate to some advanced material, but I do my best to break it down into terms you can actually understand. And then each area has 5 explicit action items. So you're not left holding the bag going, oh man, I have no idea what the hell to do with any of this stuff. Like I will literally explicitly tell you what to do next, how to determine what action item is for yourself or for your clients. And in some of the areas, I even have more advanced protocols. So for example, like in cold water immersion, I have a whole PDF protocol breakdown of if you happen to have exposure to, say, a cold plunge or you make one out of a freezer like I did, what protocol do you want to use? There's different ways you can do different things. So there is a method where you can get a massive amount of parasympathetic upregulation within literally minutes. So if you really want to jam on the brakes as hard as you can and push the body into a state of recovery, that is definitely a way you can do that. Now again, that has a cost that you probably don't want to do that the night before a really big performance because the timeline on that can extend into that performance. If you want something to upregulate your body and you've only got a couple minutes, there's a way you can do that by using cold water immersion again. So again, there's multiple ways you can use these interventions for sometimes paradoxically different things, depending upon how you're doing it. So those advanced protocols we all have in there. And as I mentioned, I've got 2 bonus items that are not in the public domain that I sent out all the information via the private newsletter. So there you go. Any questions, hit me up. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it. If you missed this round, hop on to the newsletter. The Phys Flexor will open again in March of 2026. If you missed the deadline of tonight, October 20th of midnight, 2025, Pacific Standard Time. We've got another podcast coming up very soon. Thank you so much for listening to this. We really appreciate it. I hope to see you in the Cert. If not, hope to see you on the newsletter or talk to all of you again here very soon.
This podcast is for informational purposes only. The podcast is not intended as a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. You should not use the information on the podcast for diagnosing or treating a health problem or disease or prescribing any medication or other treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider before taking any medication or nutritional supplement, and with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard on this or any other podcast. Reliance on the podcast is solely at your own risk. Information provided on the podcast does not create a doctor-patient relationship between you and any of the health professionals affiliated with our podcast. Information and statements regarding dietary supplements are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to therein. If you think you have a medical problem, consult a licensed physician.